Well, welcome everybody. It's good to see you virtually in cyberspace. What I want to do today is talk about certain aspects of the BU Archaeology project. Obviously, we started this some time ago. It was actually 2009 we first began the project, looking into ostensibly the transition from the Iron Age to the Roman period, but also trying to look at aspects of prehistoric settlement in Dorset. And I'm not going to dwell on very much about the excavations themselves or the geophysical fieldwork or other aspects of the project. We're looking at the early Bronze Age right through to sub-Roman archaeology. But what I wanted to try and do in this lecture is really focus on the BU Archaeology themselves to see, well, what have we actually learned about them? And how does our view of the BU Archaeology tribe actually change? Has it changed at all over the last sort of just over a decade since we've been doing the project? And so I've called this, obviously in the footsteps of Vespasian. I've stolen a title that both Paul and Dave Stewart created, but in a way Vespasian is linked to the BU Archaeology in multiple ways. Obviously in popular fiction, the sole purpose of the BU Archaeology are to die at the hands of an invading Roman army. So in all popular culture accounts of Dorset and the southwest, you see in any sort of general book on Roman Britain, on any sort of documentary about the early Roman period, you'll always have a presenter probably dressed in lorica segmentata, sweating as they run up a hill or firing a catapult towards a hill fort. Because the BU Archaeology are always appearing. You're doing this wonderful image. This is pre-World War II image by Alan Sorrell, depicting the east gate of Maiden Castle under attack by the Second Legion. There are huts on fire. There are desperate sort of slingers throwing stones down on the Romans as they march inevitably up towards the ramparts and start to destroy the hill fort. The BU Archaeology in popular culture, their role is to be the aggressive defenders of their territory, resisting the Roman advance. And that's pretty much all they always appear, in that early chapter, and then never again. So they are in a variety of different forms around the hill forts, trying to stave off the Roman legions, the organised and inevitable, well-armoured, well-equipped psychopaths of the Roman state, as they march across Dorset and take the hill forts one by one by one. Now, within archaeological circles, most people are aware that there are problems with this particular story, with the data set. It doesn't really support the story as it stands. In pop culture and in the wider world, perhaps we as archaeologists haven't done such a great job in communicating the problems of that particular narrative. And it might be because generally in the press, people like black and white versions of history, like yes and no answers. They don't like possiblies or maybes. But when we were first doing the work on this particular project and analysing Maiden Castle and looking at this sort of early phase of Roman Dorset, some of our results, as they were getting published, were picked up by the press. And the Daily Mail, I think it was a slow news day, so anyway, it's Christmas Day 2019, the Roman massacre that never happened. Archaeologist is accused of inventing AD 43 battle after digging up skeletons of ancient tribe, which isn't quite what we were saying. Once a story gets out into the press, obviously there's very little you can do about it. It takes on a life of its own. But this particular account is certainly the headline makes it feel like the archaeologist in question, Mortimer Wheeler, was involved in some kind of strange conspiracy theory and was fabricating finds and essentially was lying. And the Sun also picked that up. A bloody Roman massacre of Brits in Dorset never happened and was invented by early archaeologist expert claims. And not quite what we were saying, but I think it's the sense that this particular story, the story of Romans attacking hill forts, the story of a bold but ultimately futile resistance against an invading army like the army of Rome, is so ingrained in popular culture. It's so well told but it's become such a popular myth, and people want to hold on to that particular story. And much like, I guess, stories like this generates a lot of interest. And I was certainly very interested when these came out, because it generate quite a lot of interest, a lot of emails, a lot of comments. And although I'm always advised never to scroll to the bottom of an online story, like Dave Gorman, I do like to do that just to gauge the temperature, just to sort of gauge what people are saying and what they're believing. And I won't give you all the comments, because there were quite a lot, and some were quite rude. But though we get this article is an unfair attack on Wheeler, one of our greatest archaeologists, another nobody trying to rubbish our history. You had 15 minutes, go back to obscurity. The Romans were ruthless everywhere throughout Europe, except in Britain, where apparently they were very nice. Some contemporary academic trying desperately to make a name for themselves. The la-la land of universities, detached from reality. Those academic clowns. Any history that doesn't suit their liberal lefty extremist agenda gets rewritten. We should certainly stop taxpayers' funding. Universities and the liberal conspirators are changing history. Facts means nothing to them. They can't even tell the truth of what happened yesterday, never mind thousands of years ago. Heaven forbid the British people should have an history, and so on. And that's all quite understandable, because people are invested in this story. It is the story that appears time and time again, and as I say, so sort of embedded in pop culture. It's people feel attached to it. They're familiar with it, and depending on how it's actually presented, then it depends on how they are actually going to react. And of course, tied up with all this is Titus Flavius Vespasianus, legate of the Second Legion Augusta, one of the 4 legions that we know were operating in Britain in 43-44 AD. And we know a lot about, or we know arguably more about this particular general than any other at that particular time, because of course Vespasian becomes emperor AD 69, and as emperor his backstory gets recorded. And it gets recorded certainly by Suetonius, who's writing in the early 2nd century AD, the lives of the 12 Caesars. And I mean, Suetonius is not the most accurate of commentators. He's very much a court gossip, but he does tell us the early lives of Vespasian, of him fighting 30 battles, 2 powerful nations, more than 20 towns. This is the kind of sort of generic but positive tale of a Roman acting abroad, acting against barbarians. We don't know how much of this is true, how much is over-exaggeration, how much is sort of over-elaboration. And of course, there's no useful geographic information supplied with this. It'd be nice to know which towns, which nations, where the battles were. We get the slightly more useful account of Wectis, the Isle of Wight, being taken by Vespasian. We know that the Second Legion is operating towards Chichester and eventually heading westwards to Exeter and then up into South Wales. So we know the approximate area where they were fighting. We don't know how long Vespasian was in Britain, or whether any of these battles or towns taken were within that sort of southwestern area. We have absolutely no idea, but that hasn't stopped people interpreting it. In fact, most cases, the general version of those battles and towns are always placed in the extreme southwest, so the central and southwest, so usually Dorset, usually southern Wiltshire, in the so-called hill fort dominated zone. And you can see on this is late Iron Age, there's the unconscious sort of, I guess, assumption that while most of southern and southeastern Britain, they've abandoned hill forts, we've got the Opida, the largest sort of big settlements developing, there's organized societies, there's trade contacts with Rome. In the southwest, something is not changing to the same degree, socially, politically, economically, whatever, and they're still holding on to their hill forts, and society is fragmented and disparate, and perhaps at war with itself. And we can see that this is from John Petty's 1987 book, Invasion. It's a very good book, actually, as a way of trying to interpret the archaeological evidence. But I think it presents a hypothesis in a really definitive way that makes it look as if this is definitely what happened. So we have the 2nd Legion marching in towards Dorset, crosses the Avon, securing Hengistbury Head, establishing a fort at Lake Farm near Wimborne, and then marching up from that fortress, going to Spetsbury, Badbury Rings, Hod Hill, Hambledon Hill, Rosebery, so Spetsbury hill forts. These are all sort of nice. Very few of these hill forts are particularly well dated or phased. Badbury Rings, Hod Hill, of course, with its little Roman fort in the top corner, Hambledon Hill next to it, Rosebery. And then from there, advancing, attacking Weatherbury, Woodbury and Maiden Castle, and securing Weymouth. And you can see the sort of strategy as presented here is taking hill fort by hill fort by hill fort, not allowing the enemy to mass against them. It's strategic targets, one by one, falling to the relentless march of the Roman legions. Weatherbury, Woodbury, again around Bear Regis, Maiden Castle itself. And then from Maiden Castle heading up to Wadden Hill, Ham Hill, Cadbury and White Sheet Hill, going up into Somerset and Wiltshire. Once the carnage had been enacted, Cadbury Castle, White Sheet Castle. So these are hill fort, and the assumption is that these are all active and battle ready in AD 43. And of course, the reason we assume that is because of the Wheelers' excavations at Maiden Castle between 1934 and 38. Mortimer and Tessa Verney Wheeler. And I'll just sort of digress a little, because obviously their story is critical to the account of this and to our understanding of the Durotriga. So together they represent, I mean, it's been argued they are the mother and father of modern British archaeology, and I would certainly agree with that. Tessa Verney Wheeler, an exceptional field worker. She was doing most of the actual physical day-to-day excavation, planning, recording, conservation work on site, devising strategy. Mortimer Wheeler, her husband, doing more of the sort of logistics, more of the funding and the general publicity, getting people engaged on site. So although there are images of him on site, he is not ever really as full on in the mud as Tessa is. You get them to, they complemented themselves, each other really, really well. So obviously she's doing all the practical side of the digging and the resourcing, and Mortimer's doing more of the presentation, and certainly that suited their characters. We're told that Tessa was less happy in the spotlight, preferred to be in the shadows, preferred to be doing the actual work, and Mortimer increasingly enjoyed his public persona, the way of actually getting archaeology out to the public. He's the first sort of archaeologists really, I guess, attempting mass media for the time to try and generate public interest, which is all well and good, because if we don't have that, archaeologists are talking to each other. And that's a terrible thing for that to happen. We need to engage with the public. We need to get information out there. And we can see that from some of their earliest digs together at Segontium at Carnarvon in North Wales, while both were then employed by the National Museum of Wales in Cardiff. You can see, I mean, this picture is, I love this. I mean, this really does represent their relationship really well, because Tessa Verney Wheeler, who has been up to this stage been doing most of the work and the planning and the recording and the resourcing, is in the background, and it's well-dressed Mortimer at the front with the sightline rolled up, who is addressing the very well attired ladies and explaining the site. That is how they work together. We can see that at Caerleon, which they investigated 1926-7, which at the time was known as the amphitheatre, as King Arthur's Round Table. It had a lot of associations with it, thanks to Geoffrey of Monmouth and other sort of medieval writers. And evidently, both Wheelers knew this was likely to be the Roman amphitheatre, but they did play on the mythical associations of the site to try and attract interest and attract funding, and they did that extremely well. So you see, it was the Daily Mail at that stage who were the primary funders of the excavation. And you can see how well resourced it was, utilising a lot of Welsh miners and navvies with tracks and mine carts to take the soil out. Fantastic, large scale landscape modification there, and all that really, it was Tessa Wheeler doing the bulk of that, because Mortimer at that stage was moving to London, just getting a job with the Museum of London, and both he and Tessa were considering setting up the Institute of Archaeology as a training ground for future archaeologists. So seeing this wonderful image of the time. This is actually captioned as the men and women who excavated Caerleon, which I think is slightly insulting, certainly because it's Tessa Wheeler who is directing the excavation and running it, and everyone else picturing there is just moving soil. But it's a fantastic image of them together with the results of their labours. As the 1930s rolled on, as both had jobs in London, as both moving with the Museum in London, setting up the Institute of Archaeology, you can see them again, same sort of strategy at Verulamium, St Albans. Certainly both Mortimer and Tessa were adherents to this sense of historical archaeology. There was always a sense of digging up people, digging up personalities, trying to link historical events and archaeological together. And there are inherent dangers in doing that. Because obviously history and archaeology, two different types of evidence for the same event. But at Verulamium, you can see them doing that and working together extremely well and attracting interest from the press. I love these images. This is a sort of 1930. And Wheeler, Mortimer Wheeler, whenever he appears in photographs, always is where it looks like he's out on a day on the golf course. It's fantastic +4s and jacket. And Tessa, when she's not on site, is wearing the latest. Again, you can see their roles on site. She is doing basically all the planning and recording and day-to-day excavation, and he's doing a lot of the presentation. And there are some really good sort of examples of that. Hopefully the sound will work on this particular. You can all hear that on the sound.
We are standing on the site of the ancient city of Verulamium, the civic predecessor of St Albans. Verulamium was a city for a century or more before London was heard of. I am standing now upon the floor of the principal room of a Roman house. That floor is covered with a decorated mosaic, which, with its bold use of primary colors, surpasses most modern work. The walls of these Roman houses are built of flint and brick and probably carried a timber superstructure like the walls of a medieval house. These men are digging into the floor of a Roman house to find the remains of earlier houses beneath it. As they dig, they find Roman pottery and various other Roman objects. The piece of pottery just found bears scratched upon it the name of its Roman owner, Albina, Albina, a Mrs. White of the Roman period. This is a cellar behind one of the shops overlooking one of the streets of Verulamium. Very few Roman cellars have been found in this country, and this is one of the finest ever discovered here.
Love that. I mean, it's quite difficult sometimes to take that seriously now, given those sort of newsreel footages have been, a lot of Mickey taken out of them, a lot of parodies done, and especially you can see the kind of today people are a bit more media savvy about how they present things and about how they look towards the camera, and it's very sort of stilted, and that sort of very received BBC accent is fantastic. But this is one of the first times that archaeology is hitting a mass audience. You've got these newsreel footages at the cinema going all the way around the world. And the Wheeler's excavations are there, and of course it's Mortimer who is doing the presenting, and okay, his presenting skills aren't, he hasn't quite honed them at this particular stage. It's difficult to do that kind of voice loudly while standing with a cigarillo, but it's a first attempt to get mass interest and to promote the ideas of the dig. And what we don't see in that, of course, what's going on site, because again, it's Tessa Wheeler who is doing the majority of the recording and excavation and work. And at that stage, whilst they're still trying to create the Institute of Archaeology, they are engaging lots of younger men and women to become archaeologists, to train them up, and they're getting the public involved in all aspects of the investigation. So you could say this is one of the first times that archaeology or an archaeological excavation is appealing to the public. It's not just something that is done by labourers and by people who are paid to do that, and they're not going to disseminate the information at all. It's really sort of state of the art. This is the beginnings of archaeology as a popular activity. So in 1934, the Wheelers moving to Maiden Castle to investigate, and ostensibly Morton Wheeler says that he's sick of Roman archaeology and he's very keen to investigate what happens before in the Iron Age. And Maiden Castle is one of the largest. It's not the largest, but it's one of the largest hill forts in the country. It's certainly one of the most impressive with its multiple banks and ditches. And again, the excavation, as it starts there, follows the standard plan of Tessa on site, Mortimer as sort of an intermittent presence. As we can see, the majority of fieldwork photographs show Tessa either she's standing on the top of the section instructing people, or she's looking at finds. But it's fantastic seeing that, because again, you've got men and women, young and old, lots of different backgrounds, all engaged in activity. It's a real sort of military campaign on the archaeology itself. And once again, you've got an attempt to show this, to portray this work to the wider world. Wheeler later sort of defends that. I mean, I know he came under a lot of criticism at the time, this sense there were a lot of people within the establishment who didn't like the idea of the public getting involved, who felt we shouldn't be telling them, we just get on and do the archaeology, and then we'll stick it in the museum and they can see it later. Wheeler still smarting from those sort of attitudes 20 years later. In 1956, in his book Still Digging, he says, our more conventional archaeological friends sometimes raised their eyebrows and sniffed a little plaintively at all this publicity of the Wheelers, but we were not deterred. This same public was incidentally contributing in gifts, no small part of our considerable funds. But there is no developer funding, there is no massive research projects, there are no archaeological units. They are almost entirely funded by public investment, and there are slightly less salacious sides. They were selling of finds, we hear, unprovable, I think, but certainly selling pamphlets, money for guided tours, donation boxes, and lots and lots of photographs of people being taken around by the students, being sort of shown finds, getting interested in the past, because without that interest, obviously archaeology is not going to survive. And again, I'll show you this.
The lost city of Maiden Castle near Dorchester is the finest earthwork of its kind in Britain, if not in Europe. It is now being scientifically explored, and discoveries prove that the site dates back at least to the 4th century BC. Experts are probing the mystery of the huge banks and ditches and examining the Celtic temple built during the Roman period, the pit dwellings occupied by people who were fugitives from Gaul but conquerors of Britain, a cooking pot left by them, a loom weight used in weaving clothes, and ancient coins. What date are they?
4th century A.D.
Thank you.
Again, I just constantly amazes me seeing those. Just believe anyone did actually speak like that. But I love that particular footage, because what we're seeing are photographs of bits I know really well, but they're actually populated by archaeologists. You can see things being moved, you can see finds being made. And once again, that's a newsreel bit of footage that is going around the world, promoting not just archaeology, but Maiden Castle and the Wheelers, and this idea of archaeological investigation, not just in the Mediterranean, it's not just in Egypt that these kind of great archaeological projects are being involved. But unfortunately, in many sort of well, Tessa Wheeler didn't live to see the excavation. In April 1936, she died after an operation, a relatively unimportant operation, went drastically wrong, and she died whilst Mortimer Wheeler was out of the country. And at that stage, the plans were being made for the next phase of the dig. And of course, it was devastating for everybody, but the dig still went ahead without her. And you can really tell from reports at the time how, there were still well-experienced archaeologists on board. There were people like Molly Cotton, who took over. She was one of Tessa Wheeler's ex-students, who really took charge of the day-to-day activities. But you get a sense from reading the letters and the correspondence that a lot of people's hearts were not in the dig, and you can really understand why. and certainly Mortimer Wheeler, despite whatever aspects of their relationship was at, he always looks rather lost little figure standing at the side of the trenches there. Here actually was aspects of the site are being dug. But of course, it was in 1936 that the major discovery from Maiden Castle was made, the thing that elevated the site beyond just hesitate to say a standard Iron Age hill fort, but elevated it into one of the major discoveries of British archaeology. Remember, this is just before Sutton Hoo was being excavated. So the two sites just before the advent of the Second World War are the key discoveries made within British archaeology. But in the Eastgate, investigations found a whole series of burial deposits, skeletons in small oval graves and pits, some of which appeared, as Wheeler described them, as Mortimer Wheeler described them, as disordered or rather rushed burials. And to him, this was gold dust, because this represented the kind of historical archaeology that he and Tessa had searched for, had interpreted, because here was a historical event preserved archaeologically. And it was defined as a war cemetery. We've got bodies, of the 52 bodies recovered, at least 14 have got major trauma to the heads, to the shoulders, to the back. And so Wheeler saw this as the defenders of the hill fort, the Durotriges tribe, who had died in vain. Of course, the major find, one we're always presented with, is that the iron projectile embedded into the back, into the vertebra of one of the Iron Age inhabitants. And from Wheeler's perspective, I mean, this fitted perfectly with this couldn't be a better story, because he started interpreting that the Romans are arriving and they are launching an artillery barrage down onto the hill fort. Rather than just simply attacking it, we've got phases of advance. And to him, that is ideal, because he had served during the First War, Battle of Passchendaele. He was a major in the 76th Army Field Artillery Brigade. He understood the importance of artillery to soften up enemy positions prior to a major attack. And he saw the direct link between the archaeological evidence from Maiden Castle and what he knew himself as a soldier. And Maiden Castle, when it was being written up, of course, obviously the final stages of the excavation running down were as tensions were rising throughout Europe. When the major stages of the dig were coming together, it was Molly Cotton and others who were bringing together lots of Tessa's reports and drawings. Wheeler had the final edit. By that stage, he was already serving abroad. He was serving as a brigadier in the anti-aircraft brigade with the 8th Army in North Africa, fighting with Montgomery. So, and in fact, he was one of the first monuments men. Doesn't appear in the movie, of course, monuments men. Why would he? He's not an American actor. But in a sense of trying to preserve monuments which are within the theatre of war. So the final stages of the report doesn't really have his hand on it as securely as perhaps it should have had. And a lot of sections we can see are taken directly from the press reports of the time, the press releases of the time, especially when it comes to the interpretation of the battle. I'll just read you a few sections, because again, I love, this is coming from the excavation report, and bear in mind that excavation reports traditionally aren't the most exciting things to read. But this one in particular is spiced up in a central section. What happened there is plain to read. There's no equivocation here. There's no doubt. Wheeler is positive about what happened, and he presents it in a way that no one can question him. First, the regiment of artillery, which normally accompanied a legion on campaign, was ordered into action. It put down a barrage of iron-shod ballista arrows across the eastern part of the site. Following this barrage, the infantry advanced up the slope, cutting its way from rampart to rampart, tower to tower. In the innermost bay of the entrance, close outside the actual gates, a number of huts had recently been built. These were now set alight, and under the rising clouds of smoke, the gates were stormed and the position carried. Resistance had been obstinate, and the fury of the attackers was roused. For a space, confusion and massacre dominated the scene. Men and women, young and old, were savagely cut down before the legionaries were called to heel, and the work of systematic destruction began. That night, when the fires of the legion shone out, we may imagine, in orderly lines across the valley, survivors crept forth from their broken stronghold, and in the darkness buried their dead as nearly as might be outside their tumbled gates, in that place where the ashes of their burnt homes lay warm and thick upon the ground. That's fantastic. That is has no place in an archaeological report, but as a piece of writing to inspire the reader, that is amazing. And you can see why, as the press, you can see why the attention, you can see where the funding came from. Everyone loved Maiden Castle, and especially at a time, a few years before the beginning of the Second World War, this idea of invaders and defenders and massacre and empires, it really chimed with the times. But you can also see Wheeler, I mean, he came from his background essentially in journalism. His father was a journalist, and you can see this is a report that Wheeler wrote whilst on campaign in the First War, which he republished in Still Digging. And it's the same language. You can see the immediacy of his actions. The battery dropped into action. A squadron of cavalry flitted by like shadows in the mist, and a tank waddled up uneasily from the front and finally broke down beside the guns. Leaving the battery to settle into its new home, I rode forward with my staff of signallers in search of news and observation. No man's land in a fog is no place for any question exercise, and the tangled masses of wire, treacherous shell holes and other obstacles soon brought us to our feet. Dodging from bank to shell hole, our little party crept forward until at last, with grateful hearts, we stumbled upon the old German main trench where it cut the road. The trench marked the second stage of our journey. In its comparative security, we paused for breath. And again, he writes brilliantly well. He's the ideal person. He knows what people want to hear. He can convey it in an exciting way, and he can interpret the physical archaeological remains in a way arguably no one else could. So his castle is presented in inarguable fashion. This is what happened, full stop.
But Maiden Castle has a sad epilogue. Its story was taken up by archaeologist Sir Mortimer Wheeler.
The most dramatic thing that I've ever been concerned with.
He found what he believed were the remains of a vicious battle between the Romans and the ancient Britons.
I've got a clear vision almost of what happened. How it happened. They came in a rush. It's the only way they could do it. They got in amongst these chaps. They cut down the defenders, in mass formation almost. One of these Britons was cut down with no less than 7 cuts on his skull. It was a massacre. The place was littered with corpses in no time. We found 40 of them, all with fatal wounds. It was very vivid. It was dramatic.
So that's a rare clip of Mortimer Wheeler Land Rover surfing into Maiden Castle. That's from the 1973 Chronicle programme. It was reused, re-edited, and became part of Francis Pryor's programme Britain BC. But you can see, so Britain Navy, but you can see that by the 1970s, that story was still ingrained, and it's always been presented in such a way. Therefore, the popular press view of Maiden Castle is this is what happened, whilst archaeologists are going off perhaps in a different way. So popular culture, we've got the Battle of Maiden Castle, we've got the hill forts being attacked, we've got Roman and Durotrigas warriors fighting. Now, most reports, most understanding popular pop culture ignores, unfortunately, the work of people like Neil Sharples, who excavated at Maiden Castle in the mid-1980s. And a lot of what he was finding, 10 years, almost 10 years after Mortimer Wheeler had died, contradicted that result. I mean, Neil was more interested in the life of the hill fort, and a lot of the final report that Mortimer Wheeler produced was more focused on its death, on the end of activity there. But this particular conclusion Sharples made, the main feature of the late Iron Age occupation of Maiden Castle was the abandonment of the street system and internal organisation was a striking feature of the hill fort around 100 BC. It was collapsing. It was starting to not become a centre of occupation, at least almost a century and a half before the Romans arrived. And this sort of key element, this key observation, is something which most later writers ignored, perhaps because it's not a dramatic story. It's not being presented in a dramatic way, in the kind of way that Wheeler himself presented it. Therefore, it doesn't get treated the same way. but sharp others have noted, obviously, that the evidence of burning inside the East Gate is not huts being destroyed, it's metallurgy, it's ironworking. It's one of the largest sort of iron secondary reworking areas in southern British Iron Age. So we've got burning, we've got slag material. He also sort of pointed out that the story of the war cemetery doesn't account for the fact the burials with the trauma were established in a cemetery that was already there. Only 14 out of the 52 showed obvious signs of trauma. They don't have to have died there. They're buried there. They could have died anywhere. The interpretation that they effectively fell whilst fighting and then were buried where that fighting had taken place is something which certainly we would question today. And the evidence as it stands, not everything as sad has been radiocarbon. So from the cultural material, that the burials within the East Entrance date from around 50 BC to at least AD 90. You know, this is not the product of a single event, unless that siege took over a century to be enacted. This isn't Troy. Then what we are seeing is the accumulation of burials. And of course, the key point is the projectile in the spine is not a ballista bolt. It hasn't got the pyramid head typical of ballista bolt. It's an Iron Age native British spearhead. Someone has had a spear into their back, and that's obviously been the cause of death. But this is not evidence of an artillery attack. Now, what all this means, of course, I think, you know, Paul intimated just before the talk, myself, Paul, and Martin Smith have been looking at the skeletal remains. There is a report coming on that, which is being rewritten at the moment. When our conclusions are out there, we're more than happy to give a second presentation. But let's accept for the fact that these have nothing to do with an attack on a hill fort. What about Hod Hill? Hod Hill, Iron Age hill fort, Roman fort in the corner, excavated after the Second War in the 1950s in Richmond. Another very good archaeologist, but more focused arguably on the Roman phases than the Iron Age. Again, his report that you read was published after his death, but it's very heavily focused on the Roman fort and the Roman phases and the death of the hill fort, and not what was happening inside the hill fort during its life. But he did find lots of catapult bolts, these iron pyramid-headed bolts from a Roman ballista inside the hill fort. And of course, the natural assumption was these must have been fired as part of an attack. He identified in the small quadrant as excavated a number of huts, one of which had an enclosure around it. It might be a different phase, hut and the enclosure, but he viewed that as the chieftain's hut. And I'll just really give you a section of his text. Again, shows this is the kind of exciting way that you write to an audience. Small wonder if hearts quailed when the Roman legionaries, with all the prestige of a successful blitzkrieg behind them, approached the hill and began to reconnoitre the position. Such were the circumstances in which fate decreed a chieftain's hut to be situated not only within range of a ballista firing a native rampart, but opposite the southeast shoulder of the hill, where the slope provided a stance for the machine or siege tower carrying it. So he viewed this as an active hill fort like Maiden Castle, destroyed by the Romans. And the National Trust, reconstruction drawing, shows the Roman fort being built, and you can see the Iron Age houses smouldering as they're being demolished and removed, and no doubt the bodies being dragged away somewhere. Burial. The issue really, I guess, with the interpretation is that Richmond didn't get to look at much of the interior, and he was digging before the advent of geophysics. This is that Dave Stewart completed, and I've no doubt Paul will tell you more about this in his later lecture in May. As a little trailer for that. But you can see lots of roundhouses in here. This is the Richmond's excavation down here. He interpreted that as the biggest hut, therefore that's the chieftain's hut. The geophysics shows it's by no means the biggest, and there are lots of larger huts. There are lots of larger enclosures. Sometimes when I'm really bored, which is quite a lot, I like to sit and look at this image. There are beautiful roundhouses and hearths, and you can see the roads coming through and the gaps. There are 4-post structures. You know, it's a fantastic survey. Dave did an amazing job doing that sort of survey almost single-handed. But, you know, it's difficult to phase that without excavating it. But we can say from the bits of the excavation that Richmond did, it's quite clear that the hill fort, like Maiden Castle, was slowly going out of use after or around 100 BC. It certainly wasn't battle ready and active when the Roman army arrived in AD 43/44. And what very few people really sort of pointed out with Richmond is that when he excavated the Roman fort, the two things arrowed in this diagram are massive foundations by the gateway for catapults. These are designed to protect the gateways with sort of covering fire. So whereas Richmond suggested the catapults ought to have been fired from the outside in as part of an attack, they could just as easily, and perhaps more mundanely, have been fired from the inside of the fort, defending the fort if it had been attacked, or just as target practice. Firing out, there's no way of telling, because that hill had been ploughed and disturbed, where the arrows were excavated, which direction they'd come in from. And I think, arguably, given that the hill fort seemed to have been largely abandoned by the time the Romans arrived, it's more likely the fort was built to control the River Stour, and what we're looking at is the residue of practice fire on the fort itself. Spetsbury Rings, another hill fort, a very nice one, often overlooked, cut by the railways in the 1850s. When over, we're told navvies destroyed over 100 skeletons, laid irregularly, some with injuries to the heads. None of the bodies were saved. They might have been dumped in a pit, but sadly not recovered. But the majority of finds associated with those bodies were recovered and are in the British Museum. And they suggest, again, this is not a single event burial. These are a series of burials from about 50 BC up to at least the beginning, or about 100 AD. We've got cauldrons, we've got sword shapes, we've got spears, forks, currency bars. There's a whole range of material. Something is going on in the outer edge of an abandoned hill fort in that period with burials and votive deposits, but it's not that residue. And of course, we found similar sort of things excavating on the Winterbourne Kingston and part of the Durotriges project, where we were finding Iron Age crouched Durotrigian burials. They tended to, they focus in little sort of clusters, but within the banjo enclosed, an aerial photograph, most of these burials are within the entranceway of an abandoned Iron Age banjo enclosure. We found later Bronze Age ditches and features, again with crouch burials. Either they're identifying sort of the hollow of a backfield feature and thinking that's the best place to put a body because it's down soft, or they might be hijacking the significance of an earlier feature, or they're burying around it perhaps because they're linking their dead with earlier ancestral remains. Well, whatever the case, this seems to be the sorts of activity that we're seeing at Spetsbury and Maiden Castle, targeting defunct earthworks for the disposal of human remains. And many of the human remains as recovered at our excavation Winterbourne Kingston, there's not a huge mass of artifacts with them. The Durotriges, they've got a lot of type markers with their black burnished ware pottery and certain types of brooch and bone decorated handles and obviously Durotrigian coins. But they're not very, they're not a massive consumer society. There's not a lot of objects associated with their settlements, indeed with their burials. This is one of the better appointed graves that we excavated during the major part of the dig. We're also involved in the recovery of this burial at Langton Herring, which metal detectors had found, and then contacted Dorset FLO and the museum, and we came up and helped with that excavation. We've got a decorated bronze mirror, so that's the back of it with this sort of swirling Celtic design, buried upside down with the deceased. So we've got a young adult female there with that object with a series of glass beads, not to scale. These are quite small glass beads, but some of these originating from Northern Europe. And the only sort of recognisably Roman datable artefact in there was this nice, this is a Republican coin dating to about 83, 84 BC. And I love this because I think this perfectly encapsulates the Durotriges relationship with Rome and everything Rome represents, in that they will take stuff that best suits them and adapts to their lifestyle, but they're not like the tribe, like the Atrebates, the Regni, or the Cativalorni to the south and east, who seem to be welcome consumers of Roman culture. Here we've got a single coin, and what's actually, it's been pierced to be worn. And the face of Jupiter on one side, have a hole gone through the face. But what they've done on the reverse side is they carefully pierce the hole so it misses Victory. So it was a winged Victory sitting in a chariot or standing in a chariot, and it's a quadriga. It's one of those 4-horse chariots pulling off the chariot into the distance. And it's, that is the image that they wanted. They wanted to express sort of equestrianism and chariots and status. That's, they didn't really care this was a Roman coin. It's not expressing allegiance to Rome. It's not being used for anything. It's to be worn as a decorative item. And when we're looking, one of the key problems that we're coming up with time and time again with our sites is that there is, in Dorset, as indeed with the rest of southern Britain, this is event horizon of around 100 BC, when hill forts and banjo enclosures are starting to go out of use. Whatever society, whatever structure brought them into being, it's changing by the beginning of the 1st century BC. On our site, we excavated part of a larger settlement nicknamed Geropolis, with round houses, which seems to partially fill in that gap, because it seems to be in the 1st century BC, but it's going to the 1st century AD. What can really be recognised as a type site of the Durotriges are these strange polygonal enclosures, sometimes with huts and storage pits. Jeff Wainwright excavated one at Gussage All Saints, and one at Berwick Down. Tolpuddle Ball excavated by Wessex Archaeology, woodcuts by Augustus Pitt Rivers. And you can see again, this seems to be small enclosed farming settlements. If the Durotriges are anything, they are a dispersed society across the Dorset Downs. In much the same way as in Devon and in Cornwall, we are getting very sort of dispersed society settlements. None of the big organised, concentrated masses of people that the Romans seem to be encountering in the south and east. Even at Maiden Castle, again, part of the geophysical survey there, Dave, located in the top part, you can see this is an area previously unexcavated, that there is one of these, well, actually 2 of these little polygonal enclosures. There's something below it which could be early Iron Age, but that seems to be our Durotrigian farmstead. So when the Romans arrive in AD 43, there may be no more than 20 people living on Maiden Castle. This isn't a big siege of a battle-ready hill fort. It is part of the more sort of generalised picture of dispersed farming across the area. We located one at Winterbourne, Kingston, which we then excavated as a geophysical survey. So there's part of the students excavating that in 2017. You can see an aerial photograph of that enclosure. Materials within that suggested a date in the early half of the 1st century AD. The Jewish coinage, some Samian coming in. But it looks as if the banks of the enclosure have been deliberately levelled, have been ploughed out, and lots of cultural material dumped in the ditches. And you could interpret the Roman army arriving and slaughtering the inhabitants and smashing down their settlement, or the site is being forcibly abandoned and ploughed out. Lots of nice pottery in the ditch there. It could be akin to what we're seeing in the 18th and 19th century, the highland clearances, small-scale peasant farming being replaced by perhaps more intensive forms of agriculture or pastoral agriculture. But there's no need for these little groups of people getting in the way of what the Roman state wants to do in that territory. So the picture's a little less clear-cut than perhaps Mortimer Wheeler suggested. Having said that, we have found possibly some evidence of Vespasian himself, given that the fortress at Lake Farm, there is a Roman fort known here really from the late 1950s. Norman Field and later Graham Webster excavated there. The Paul Museum Service excavated there. Finds are distributed primarily between Wimborne Museum and Paul Museum. Sadly never published, although lots of interim statements were. And we conducted, Paul and Dave conducted a geophysical survey of that. And you can see the legionary fortress, the campaign fortress preserved. And again, I'm not going to go into too much detail because I know Paul was itching to do that in May. But you can see the outline of the fort there underlying the road. That's the Wimborne bypass. As you're driving down that towards your West Country holiday home, you're driving over the remains of the fortress of the 2nd Legion. Most of the lines inside represent drains underlying roads. There are 4 key entrances, and you can divide up the interior fairly nicely. You know, a Roman fort is pretty much the same wherever it's built. So we've got barracks, Tribunes' houses, granaries, etc. And right in the middle, a Principia headquarters building and a Praetorium, the commander's house. And assuming that Vespasian was still commanding the Second Legion when this fort was established, then we can say his house is there under the road. It's at the point where the bypass comes, so it's bypass on the line of the old railway embankment, and there's an embankment as the farm track goes over. Both completely cover the house, which is immensely frustrating. This is the one sort of historically attested individual we've got for Dorset. But anyway, he's there somewhere. That's his home from Rome. We can say that the Lake Farm is a key base for the Roman army as it moves westwards, but is it the same kind of campaign that we see in most texts? David Johns produces a fantastic sort of computer-generated model of a geophysical survey based also on the excavations, and you can see the fortress there. One of the most interesting bits, I think, from my perspective, or from our perspective, is it does appear to have a vicus, a civilian settlement, outside the fortress, showing up here, the line of the road. I don't know why I'm pointing at the screen, can't see my finger, but you've got the Roman fort arrow, the road going out, and there's evidence of civilian structures along there. So it could be this fort, although it's not well placed, it's great for accessing by the river, but it's, it does flood a lot, hence the name Lake Farm. But it could be it was there for a few years whilst that civilian settlement grew up. At the moment, we can't be precise about the dating. We've sample excavated a few of the areas around. This is part of the industrial complex, or appears to be industrial complex to the south of the fort, full of charcoal and other signs of metalworking. Lake Farm, as a fortress, when it's abandoned, like all military installations created by the Romans, they carry anything they can't carry with them. No one's going to get their hands on this stuff. Same in pottery, smashed, and other containers broken up, and quernstones thrown away, and glassware deposited. At Hod Hill, the excavations up there found large amounts of Roman military kit deliberately buried. This is what they do, is that they're extremely wasteful from a modern perspective before they move on. So they're travelling light. And Mike Trevarthen found in Dorchester relatively recently evidence of a named individual of the Second Legion, part of a tombstone that had been used as part of a door sill in the town. And the translation, Lucius Didius Bassus, son of Lucius, from Macedonia, so from the Eastern Mediterranean, a veteran of the Second Legion Augusta, age 55, presumably served at Lake Farm, died in the closest settlement and was buried there on the sort of eastern outskirts of the town. So we've one named inhabitant, but the sense is when we look at Dorchester as a Roman town, it ain't very successful. When you compare it with other towns across the south, it's small. The infrastructure is built. There's got an amphitheatre, a bathhouse. Most of these are in decay or being abandoned or used for other activities in the 2nd and 3rd century. It's only by the time we're getting into the late 3rd and 4th century do we see a real explosion of wealth in the town. That's when we get our mosaics. That's when we get our high status houses. And it's easy to be blinded by that and assume this is what Roman culture is all about. And this is what it was like for 400 years. It's not. This seems to be what's happening towards the end of the Roman period. And what's occurring in between, I mean, this is a reconstruction by John Hodgson of a little rural settlement in South Wiltshire. But this, I think, stands more for what's happening in Dorset in the Roman period between AD 43 and AD 320. We're not seeing a lot of Romanisation. We're seeing longhouses. We're seeing one or two early villas, some quite nice, but the big explosion, like sort of Frampton and other sort of sites, does seem to be it's like 40, 50, 60 years before the end of Roman Britain. Suddenly, big palatial structures are being built and older villas are being expanded. And so the key worry is this the Durotriges? Is this the local population who are becoming Roman, or is it someone from another part of the empire moving in and accessing and developing a relatively underused and under-resourced landscape? I think it's probably the latter. And the key thing, really, I guess, about the Durotriges is the sense that they may not be the active resistors, the aggressive defenders of the land that Mortimer Wheeler gave them, but there's arguably a more subtle story about passive resistance and not becoming Roman to be told. And that's really for another time, hopefully, as we restart the project, pandemic willing, in the future. Thank you.